Hello, class. Before we got started today talking about domestic politics and war, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about your exams. It's come to my attention that none of you guys can actually see your exam scores, which is a shame because you guys did very, very well. I had graded and posted all of them, but yet you guys still can't see them. But don't worry, I have the good people at Moodle working on that. You should be able to see them by the end of the day with any luck. I'm really, really hoping. So without further ado, let's talk about domestic politics and war. So, like I said, we're talking about domestic politics and war, which is a little bit different than what we talked about last week when we were talking about international conflict and the international causes for war. This week, we're going to be talking about some of the more internal causes for war. And some of my class here at Texas Tech thought that I was a little bit conspiratorial. And I promise you, there's nothing conspiratorial about these lectures and about this lecture and about some of the things we're going to be talking about. It's just that we have to understand that there are some domestic reasons why we go to war. We're going to be talking about domestic politics inside the country. We're also going to be talking briefly about institutions in war, namely democracy, and some of the problems with democracy that cause us to either go to war or not to go to war. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is interests, okay? We have to understand that there's different interests involved, and there's outside interests and there's internal interests. What we're talking about here is domestic politics. So we're going to be talking about interests inside. There's two types. There's national. Oftentimes we think about national security as a national interest. But there's also particularistic interests, and these can be profit. It can be, expanding of a business. It can be a promotion inside your company. And these very particularistic interests can have an effect and put us closer and closer to war. The first interest we need to think about is the interests of our leaders. What interests do they have? Well, Mayhew tells us from 1974, he says that re-election is the main motivating goal for any leader. Now, in order to do that, and if we're talking about war and the interest they have in re-election, the first issue they have to do is win the war. Speaking of a leader that we had, in 1950, we had Dwight D Eisenhower talk about these interests, these particularistic interests. And what did he say? He warned us of a military-industrial complex. He saw that the military and the bureaucracy had become so close to the government that it became indistinguishable. And the interest that led them to more profit was only war. It was going to push us further and further into wars. If we look, in 1950, the total U.S. budget was $40 billion. Nearly a little over 1/4 of that was spent on the military expenditure, right? Only 10 years later, the budget had increased to $92 billion, but now we were looking at 2/3 of it spent on military expenditure. And what came out of this was a major industry. We are talking about the birth of Boeing. We're talking about the birth of Lockheed Martin, the birth of IBM. Eventually, we'd have Raytheon and other extremely powerful MIC complex companies. And so when Eisenhower was warning us about the military-industrial complex, what he was really saying was that our country had become locked in this iron triangle, right? Where we have large military corporations, Congress and government, and the Department of Defense, okay? We often call this the iron triangle. It's where government, industry, and bureaucracy all come together by different types of funding. So industry gets large contributions to government, government sends tax funding down to the bureaucracy, and bureaucracy sends contracts to these corporations. Potential test question here. Do leaders ever spark war to keep power at home? Answer, or one of the answers, would be the rally around the flag theory. Okay, a few brief examples. Okay, Britain was once ruled by a lady. She was a prime minister. She was Margaret Thatcher. Okay, in 1980s, they were going through a pretty severe recession. We all were. Every industrial country was. And that's because of the oil embargo put in place by OPEC. Now, her popularity was down the drain. Then something happened. Argentina, way down in South America, decided to take back a hold of a set of islands that the UK had claimed, called the Falkland Islands. Well, Margaret Thatcher took this opportunity and said that she would fight tooth and nail for these islands and went to war with Argentina and eventually won back the islands. But what we can see that happened is, as soon as Argentina raised its flag on those islands, and the second that Margaret Thatcher decided to fight back for those islands, her popularity went through the roof, eventually winning her re-election. Second example, President W. Bush. Now, after 9/11, he had started to see his popularity begin to fall. Okay, he had once reached 90%, which is the highest the president had ever been, but it was quickly falling. So what did he do? Well, he went to the war game. He started challenging Saddam Hussein, started saying that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and eventually went to war with Iraq. Now, the same thing that happens to all leaders when they go to war, we become united around our leader. And you can see that the invasion of Iraq boosted his popularity, again, just like the capture of Saddam Hussein, and again, just like September 11th, where he reached 90%, which is, again, the highest a president had ever been. But one thing you have to keep in mind is these peaks always have downslopes, right? Nobody can stay on top forever. The key is to stay on top long enough so that you can be re-elected. So the rally around the flag effect, the definition is an increased short-run popular support of a leader during periods of international crisis and war. Now, it's also important to keep in mind, these are also called diversionary foreign policy. And that's not the only one we're going to talk about. There's another form of diversionary foreign policy that we're going to talk about very, very soon. But first, I want us to really understand how the rally around the flag effect works, especially when we talk about bargaining range. Okay, if you remember, the bargaining range is any set of deals that a leader can make to avoid going to war. Okay, here on the left we have A, and then all the way to the right we have A's ideal point. They want all of that green line. In between that red line is the bargaining range. Okay, so what happens when we apply the rally effect to this model for war? What ends up happening is, what we see is that it moves the bargaining range further towards A's ideal point. Okay, now what this does is, since the bargaining range is closer to A's ideal point, this effectively gives the leader more leverage in going to war. Essentially, the people are behind the leader when he says that he's going to go fight for our country. Okay, so a second diversionary tactic is when a leader uses the machines of war to prop up a flagging economy. Oftentimes, this is called wag the dog. Okay, wag the dog just means using war or crisis to divert attention away from a leader's failings. Let's say the economy is failing. You as a leader want to start saying, "Hey, over here, don't look at the economy," and we can see that throughout history, we have constantly used war to give us a short economic boost, right? Even if we look at the Civil War to World War I to especially World War II, and all the way through to our financial crisis of '06, what this does is, when we go to war, we have to borrow lots and lots of money. Now, this borrowing of money it gives us the feeling that we're under stimulus. It gives a feeling that our GDP is rising rapidly. And this makes us feel like our economy is just fine, okay? But are there any downsides to using these kind of war tactics? Well, of course there is, especially if the war tends to drag on. You're going to start to see popularity start to decline. And that's because Americans start to see other Americans die. If we look at this graph right here, we can see that on the up and down axis, we see the total support for the war. And on the left to right axis, we see the total battle deaths, right? So the further we get right to left, that means there's more death. And as we see more and more death, we start to see the bodies stack up, so to speak. We become less and less interested in war, except for what looks to be World War II, where we in the international relations scholarly community start to think that this is a moral war. War and the fate of leaders, right? So it's always important if you're a leader and you start a war that you must win this war, okay? And this graph right here shows both autocrats, dictators, democratically elected leaders. So this works for every leader, right? So that you have to win to be able to stay in power, because if you lose, if you have a big loss, only about 15% of them stay in power. Now, what if we split up and say, how does a dictator fare compared to a democratically elected leader? Well, war is risky for democratic leaders, because if you look, during a dictator, if you're a dictator and you have a loss, you only have a 50-50 chance of losing power. Whereas if you are a Democrat and you were democratically elected and you lose this war, you only about 12% of those men and women stay in power when they lose a battle. Okay, moving on. There may be other groups that may be associated with internal conflict that begins wars, and we call these military-industrial complex groups. Okay, they have a selfish interest contrary to the national interests. All right, they're not always looking for national security; they are looking for profit. What types of groups are we looking at? Well, there's of course political parties that want to remain in power. There's economic interest groups, and that's what we're going to be talking about here very shortly. There's also ideological and ethnic interest groups. We might see things like ISIS and Boko Haram in this group. And there's also bureaucratic interests. And America is completely full of bureaucratic interests. We look at our own military and our Department of Defense, where they would love to go to war because it increases their budgets. Does anybody remember who this gentleman is? This gentleman is Mr. Dick Cheney, a former vice president of the United States under George W. Bush. Now, his claim to fame is that many people feel that during the Bush presidency, it was under him and his tutelage that W. Bush was being driven to war with Iraq. Now, why would Mr. Dick Cheney want to go to war? Well, Mr. Dick Cheney used to be the CEO of a company called Halliburton. And we can see that under Cheney, Halliburton did fairly well. And then 9/11 happened. After 9/11, while Mr. Dick Cheney was Vice President of the United States, he took us to war with Iraq. And what happened to the profits of Halliburton under Dick Cheney and under the terms of war in Iraq? Well, we saw profits skyrocket. Okay, so how do these groups with particularistic preferences prevail? Well, we all know the well-known issue of the collective action problem. Smaller groups equal better organized, right? Larger groups, there's a lot of free riding, a lot of disorganization. So these smaller groups like Halliburton, like the Department of Defense, like these iron triangles, they shape policy to support their narrow interests, i.e. profit, okay? They also use war in this instance. If they go to war, this leads to increased budgets. It also leads to increased promotion opportunities for people in these warlike businesses. And some of these warlike businesses we're talking about people like ExxonMobil, like Northrop Grumman, things like that. The costs fall on society as a whole. That means that we all pay the costs. No matter what, we as consumers will pay the taxes that it takes to go to war. When we start borrowing and our debt increases, it is up to us to be able to pay them. However, the benefits fall on these specific groups. Again, like I said, ExxonMobil, Northrop Grumman, a lot of banks also get involved and also make a lot of money in times of war. One of the last things we need to talk about when it comes to domestic politics is this idea of hawks and doves. Okay, now hawks favor war, doves favor peace. How does that affect the bargaining range? Well, when a leader is a dove, you enlarge the bargaining range. That increases the odds that there will be some deal that they can find to avoid going to war. Now, the opposite of this is the hawk. If we have a hawk in power, we see a much smaller bargaining range. That means there's less and less deals that can be made in order to avoid going to war. Again, Dove's large bargaining range, Hawk's small bargaining range. Okay, very easily test question. Okay, now that ends our domestic politics. Let's start talking about some of the institutions in war. One of the most important institutions of war is our military, right? And the military can have severe issues when it comes to some of our politics. This is a picture from Thailand. The Thai military actually held a coup and held the entire government and took them out of power and maintained power for themselves. If the military has a problem with the government, then we are going to see large-scale changes, okay? But that was a monarchy. We live in a democracy. Are democracies less prone to going to war? Well, we've claimed that they are. Now, what are the reasons for this? Well, some of the reasons are we hold our leaders more accountable than other types of governments. Because we vote them in, they have to essentially bend to our will, okay? This forces a consensus between the elites that rule us and the masses that vote for them, okay? It's also very imperative to keep in mind that, again, the masses bear the cost. We will pay these taxes that we are spending on all of this military funding, on our troops, on more missiles, on planes. And keep in mind that democracies promotes the norms of negotiation. So we carry these values of every voice needing to be able to be heard. We are not dictators. We do not say what needs to be. We share the burden, okay? This picture is from 2003 in Germany, when the United States was trying to get Germany to side with us in our war with Iraq. Well, the Germans were fixing to vote for their new chancellor. So what ended up happening was nobody in the government wanted to side with an unpopular war for fear that they may lose the election. And, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. As we look throughout time, we're starting to see that more and more and more we're seeing democracies being spread across the globe. And we're actually seeing wars actually declining because of this. So that's what we are talking about when we talk about domestic politics and war. This lecture was basically just how the internal characteristics can affect our chances for going to war. And hopefully you understand that there is internal characteristics that can cause us to go to war. So we have a couple prompts for you guys to write about this week. The first one is, given what we know of the military-industrial complex from the past, what, if any, influences are currently affecting the leadership's decisions? Does the military-industrial complex have any hold on power in America today? Why or why not? So we know Eisenhower said it in the 50s, but does it still hold today? And if you want to choose the second prompt, we have, it is often said in IR that democracies do not fight each other because we share common values. Do you actually believe this? What common values are these scholars referring to? And is there any possibility that democracies will fight each other in the future? Why or why not? Again, I always just expect a one-page, double-spaced, MLA-consistent essay with at least 2 academic sources, cited in text as well as a reference page at the end. If you guys have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me. I am hopefully going to, I'm working with Moodle. Hopefully we get those test grades up very, very soon. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye, guys.